were the eye of the storm to come. However, rather than living in a calm refuge watching the swirling winds devour the space outside our own, we were an inverted eye. Our town was the epicenter, and the further you fled from where we settled, the safer you were. As a traditional arcanist, a lawyer of magic, my father moved our family to Boise City, Oklahoma. I was 3 at the time, to protect the interests of one of his old friends. The friend, Delber, was one of the original homesteaders who was scammed into migrating to the settlement in Cimarron County, the tip of the Panhandle. Delber, along with thousands of other homesteaders, were beguiled into purchasing a total of 3,000 lots by scamming magicians. The infamous trio, J.E. Stanley, A.J. Klein, and W.T. Douglas, had laced their brochures with a hidden charm enchantment before distributing them. They promised an arcade of booming businesses, elegantly paved roads, and beautiful untouched land. Only the land was genuine, but it wasn't beautiful. Still, what were 3,000 families to do? After the magicians were tracked down and arrested by federal mages for mail fraud, it was also discovered that the titles to the lots they promised were ingenuine. The homesteaders came together and officially incorporated in 1925. It was in that summer that my father agreed to help Delber. My father promised to protect the investments, interests, and trust of his friend and the other settlers. We would be their magical representation, and we would act as their legal stewards. Now, I am 12, gifted with the talent in memorizing language, and blessed with an early control over magic. My father, Edmund Bacchius, thinks highly and expects much from me. My mother, Gladys Bacchius, loves and pushes me to achieve everything. I, Isabelle, don't want to disappoint either of them. But I failed them the day the winds began to stir. It was the summer of 1934, and I was playing with my friend Kelby. He and I were the same age, but our friendship was forged from more than convenience. He was fascinated by my family's abilities, and I loved his mother's apple pies. I gave him showers of light, and he gave me steamy treats. That day, my father was consulting with his about their purchase of a second Arc Mecha combine harvester, so we had full reign of his land, his sun-baked fields. We were hiding behind the woodpile behind his house, giggling after our heist, when we started speaking in hushed tones. "This pie is marvelous, your mother's best accomplishment and your own worthy catch," I excitedly whispered.
"Sure thing, Sab,"
he beamed. He loves calling me Sab. I might have mentioned my distaste for my full name to him some years ago, but instead of calling me an elegant Bella, he selected a random middle portion, S-A-B. "The first 3 letters I learned," he proudly informed me.
"You know, though,"
he began, twirling his straw hat in his hands. His starchy pants were smudged with dirt, and my own were likewise. My mother might have objected to my more practical dress if we were back east, but here, in the fields of Oklahoma, this was practically my Sunday best.
"You know the deal."
He was, like he always did, reminding me of our ongoing arrangement. I gave a mischievous smirk, and we set the tinned pie on the dirt in front of us. Magic made me feel dangerous, like I was doing something I perhaps shouldn't have, at least not with the present justification and company. Despite my fit of giggles, I forced myself to a more serious mood. Magic, my father had always warned, can be volatile and chaotic. Magic does not serve the language, he always reminded me. Language serves magic. I realized I was shutting my eyes. I forced one open to glance at Kelby, who was watching me with his mouth a little open and his eyebrows set in an anticipated stitch. I stretched out a grin to reassure him, and, after taking in a few breaths, began a quick recitation. Ovia, Cetera, Cincela, Lotero, Taro, Mago, Marcana. I felt the language burn in my mouth, tingle in my throat, flow around my teeth. When I started, it was hard to stop. It just continued and streamed out of me like raw passion, like an outpouring of laughter, like an uncontrollable sobbing. Before us, on the pie, little blue sparks began to surface from the syrup. First only a few, but then a dozen, then 2 dozen, dancing around on the crust like a bumpy ballroom. The flurry of blue light swirled like a trough drain, then switched direction, then trailed in little tributaries off the pie into the ground like streams of ants. I finished my recitation and wiped my mouth with the corner of my sleeve, giving a quick sniff. Talking so quickly made my nose run, and I started getting a little dizzy. I watched Kelby's expressions and was outwardly pleased. Kelby was bathed in a soft blue glow, as was I, and on his face held the wonder of a toddler. He was easy to please, but never ceased to find amazement in magic. I loved having him for an audience.
Delber, you don't need to worry.
I paused, straining my ears. Kelby didn't seem to hear anything, transfixed as he was by my mage lights. It sounded like my father talking to Kelby's dad. Weren't they just at our house? "Kelby, dirt, now!" I hissed. He protested at first, but when I pointed toward the window to the kitchen above us, he suddenly understood, and we scrambled to scoop handfuls of dirt, though dust was more accurate after the several hot summers we had had over the blue sparks. I hadn't quite yet mastered dispelling, and our beautiful pie was an unfortunate victim of my lack of preparation. It didn't perish in vain.
I don't know if I could handle another crop failure, Ed.
I heard Kelby's dad say. I heard a muffled voice below me mutter. It was only then I realized that, in an effort to put out the sparks and duck lower below the window and woodpile, I ended up on top of Kelby, shoving his head down into the ground. I shushed him.
This second harvester should keep you up.
I heard my dad dismiss Delber's concern.
Even if something were to go wrong, consider the new one to be a second bank account and investment.
There was a pause, then
It's true about the banks up north. They're failing.
another pause.
Yes, some of my contacts have gone dark.
I heard my father admit.
Some banks were even caught magically forging their own banknotes during the runs.
He was interrupted by the booming voice of Delber.
And the black blizzards, they true too? Sweeping across the farms up north too?
Black blizzards? I had never heard of those before, and my curiosity began growing.
They're not magic, Delber, they're natural. Just some dust storms, bigger than usual, yes, but they shouldn't do too much damage to your house or the harvesters. The Arc Mecha model has a light shielding enchantment that encases the engine, so no amount of dust will plug it up.
You and your magic mumbo, Ed.
It is good info to know.
I heard a sigh, and 2 sets of heavy footprints making their way towards the opposite end of the house. I heard Kelby's dad's bass voice echo back.
Fired up this afternoon.
Sam!
I realized I was still practically sitting on Kelby's head, and I rolled off of him. He coughed and splutters, kicking up dust. "Sorry," I muttered, but my mind was elsewhere. As he finished his fit, I heard an engine roaring to life somewhere, probably from the north field of the house. We'd have to walk around the side of the wall to catch a glimpse of it.
Oh no!
I heard a moan.
The pie!
Kelby was mourning the dust-encrusted grave of the smashed savory apple.
Oh man, Ma's gonna kill me!
No more than she already would have for you stealing it. Despite ourselves, we chuckled, and Kelby quickly got over the casualty. That night, I saw a candle light up in Kelby's window across the dusty street. Our emergency signal. I was having some trouble getting to sleep. Otherwise, I would have missed it completely. So I rolled out of bed, tiptoed over to the window, cracked it open, and shot a few red sparks out into the air. They highlighted the dusty air, but died quickly. I saw his candle flicker out. After pulling on my boots and some decent coveralls, I slipped out my window and dropped to the ground a few feet below. I jogged to the back of Kelby's house, half hunched over, and found him just off his back porch, fixing a wrench to his belt. I waved at him in the full moonlight, casting a hazy glow in the air.
My dad's harvester broke.
He said quietly.
It's really important he gets it up and running. He was talking about how our wheat's already dying with all the sun.
And you're planning on fixing it with that wrench you're holding? I saw him smile, and he dropped his hand from his belt. He shook his head and bent down by the porch, pulling out a red toolbox from under the steps.
Nah, I have my own toolbox, thank you. I got a wrench, screwdriver, bolts. Mana compressor, gauge.
He listed off the different implements he had collected or saved up for over the years. I was impressed, especially by the mana compressor, though I didn't think he knew how to use it. I yawned. Kelby, why are we doing this in the middle of the night? Kelby's smile dropped, and he crushed a tuft of grass in the dirt.
My dad's birthday's coming up, and it's been hard since Ma died.
He looked sheepishly at the ground.
I kind of want to show him he can rely on me, but you don't have to come if you don't want to.
I thought about it for a few seconds, if only to increase his tension. I didn't want him to think I would do things like this for him whenever. After an acceptable amount of time, I shrugged and said, "What are friends for?" He quickly looked up at me and gave me a wide grin.
Really? You'll come?
I smiled back. "Let's get to it." Energized, we set off into the dark toward the north field. If we were paying attention, we might have picked up on a low, faint, near-silent rumble, or at least noticed the uncanny quiet of the crickets in the still night air. But we were obsessed with our quest and determined that nothing would distract us. When we were just within the crop line of wheat and away from Kelby's house, we grabbed each other's hands, partly for safety, but mostly out of fear of the dark, and I raised my hand, muttering to myself in the archaic language. Making light was, more or less, the only thing I was capable of, but I was at least reliably able to light our way. When my hand began to glow, I shook myself a little, getting lightheaded, but Kelby didn't waste any time. He pulled us forward in confidence, weaving his way through the crackling, stiff stalks. It took us nearly an hour to locate the harvester. Even with Kelby's knowledge of the land and my light, we backtracked and looped around over and over again. I wasn't sure we'd ever find it. At long last, though, we came upon the wide, bright red contraption. It looked like the squat relative of a fire truck, with a gaping mouth level with the ground, spitting slats that gobbled up wheat, and a chute off at a weird angle to spit out the husks and stalks. We both breathed sighs of relief. The harvester looked eerie in my gray light, which by then was flickering and threatening to go out, but we were nevertheless happy to see it. I put my free hand on the heavy iron, still warm from the sun and the running engine from earlier. While I worked to recast my spell, Kelby started sorting through his toolbox on the ground next to the harvester, pulling out a variety of metal implements. We worked in relative silence, occasionally discussing interesting facts or gossip we had become privy to, but our interaction was largely limited to instructions. I raised my hand, he turned a few bolts, I tiled my hand left and down, he reached in and yanked at a belt. I placed my hand next to a gap. He peered into a mysterious hole. This was the corpse of some mythical beast, and we were the dirty scientists poking, prodding, and smacking it with metal instruments. I think it was the noise we were making, far out in that hushed field, that masked the approach of an even larger beast. We had reached the end of the next hour, and my hand light was beginning to flicker. Kelby called a break, and we both climbed to the very top of the harvester to look at the moon while I reset my spell.
Hey, Sab?
Kelby asked. "Yes, Kelby."
I heard rumors that some families got to move away out west or somewhere. 'Cause their crops were failing and they couldn't afford their land. My dad's pretty well off, but in a year from now or something, if the crops die again, what if I have to leave?
His confession was labored with occasional stretches of silence. He was looking down at his boots, and I was tracing a simple mandala in the dust of the smooth roof. It took me a while to open my mouth and reply. It had worked itself into an involuntary grimace. "I don't think that's going to happen, Kelby. My dad will help your dad if that happens. That's why we moved here in the first place, so my dad could help people like you in case they get in trouble." We sat in silence for a few moments more. My ears were uncomfortable. Kelby then looked at me and held me in his blue eyes. He shook his head.
Sab, what I don't think is...
I immediately raised my free hand and pushed it against his mouth, silencing him. "Shh. What's that?" He asked, muffled. "I hear something." I looked back and forth like a dog trying to pick up a scent. Something was wrong. Something was different. Something was making me afraid. Kelby's eyes grew wide in confused fear. It wasn't until I looked up that I realized the moon was gone. It happened so gradually we hadn't realized, but my hand light was distracting us from the glow in the sky, and now that the moon was gone, the sky was frighteningly empty and...
Isabelle?
Kelby pointed at my hand. In the gray glow, we could see swirling dust flying past, stirring up eddies and vortexes in the air. I swallowed, my throat growing dry and eyes watering in terror. It hit me. It's a black blizzard. The sound, which we were only just then noticing, sounded like an earthquake. We didn't pick up on it because it happened so gradually, and now that it was happening, it was too late.
We have to get out of here!
We scrambled off the harvester, and holding hands, we began flailing our way through the wheat, roughly in the direction of where we thought the house was. We had to make a decision and go for it. The first gusts hit us like a tidal wave. It yanked at our hair, tossed Kelby's toolbox from his hand, and shoved me away from him. I raised my hands up to my face protectively, my hand light trying to cut through the dust, but were it day, I might have seen 5 feet in front of me. This was at night, in an inky jet blackness utterly redefined by the angry dust.
Kelby! Isabelle! Isabelle!
It was a nightmare. I consumed the dust by mouthfuls, and in turn, the dust consumed me. It blackened my vision, assaulted my ears, assaulted my nose, scratched at my skin. I coughed and gasped. I had to try and cast a spell. I was already tired and I couldn't get a grip on myself, but I had to try. I had to call for help. I couldn't do this alone. We couldn't find each other alone. I was coughing, gasping. I couldn't breathe. Kelby, oh, Kelby. Krenab, Nablo, Hong, Torko. I struggled through my recitation. It was so messy. There was no way it would work, but I fueled whatever mana I had left. My entire being, my will to live, my plea for help into the few sentences. I finished, but somehow I was on my hands and knees. I was lost. I couldn't see anything. I didn't know if it worked. My eyes were caked with dust. I couldn't see it even if I did it. My ears were a mess. Even if it had gone off, I wouldn't have been able to hear it. I ducked my head between my knees and curled into a ball. I sobbed, but my eyes were too dry for tears. I'm so sorry.
Isabelle, where are you?
I heard a voice roaring over the howling wind, speaking in a foreign tongue. I thought I was hallucinating. I had no idea how much time had gone by. I raised my head and dared to squint through the crusted crack of one eye. I saw a light in the swirling void. It was like a circle, a white halo, moving steadily through the field. So many of the stalks were being cut down by the voracious gale, so I was offered an unobstructed sight. I heard the voice boom again.
Isabelle!
It was my father. He was surrounded by an orb of crackling energy, keeping the dust from reaching him. He was like a pebble in a raging river, self-contained, whole, gleaming like the reflection of water. Dad! My sputtering was more of a cracked garble. There was no way he would have heard me. But I saw him catch sight of my scared and trembling figure in the stubble. He rushed over to me, picking me up in his arms, and as soon as I was within his grasp, there was a sudden, blessed silence, and relief flowed through me, like warmth racing from my heart to my fingertips. I shuddered and fell into darkness. I somehow managed to send it off into the sky, where it burst in color and sounded like a firework. He and Delber both discovered our absences at the same time, and perhaps prompted by divine insight, felt that something was wrong, though that wasn't the first time we had mischievously stole away in the night together. He rushed over to Delber's house, on the way noting the haze beginning to obscure the moon. Delber explained how he had mentioned the harvester to Kelby earlier that day, when the winds picked up. My dad placed protective wards on both himself and Delber, and the two men rushed off into the field after us. My dad was lucky and found me quickly. Delber had no such luck. We didn't find Kelby until the sun began to rise. He was barely breathing. He was barely distinguishable from the wheat. Severe pneumonia had already set in, and he would not live to see the next morning. I had to grow up quickly during the Dust Bowl. We all did.